The contrast effect. If you want to trick your brain into begging to do your taxes, the best thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Sit alone in a quiet room with no phone, no music, no screens, and zero stimulation for 15 straight minutes. Force yourself to do the opposite of what you usually do. Just do nothing. Your brain doesn't judge a task in a vacuum. It judges it against your other options. If your alternatives are Instagram, sugar, and binge-watching TV, doing actual work feels like torture because it's competing with effortless dopamine. Constant scrolling and notifications have inflated what your brain thinks normal stimulation is. In order to actually crave hard work, you have to force a recalculation. In psychology, the contrast effect dictates that perception changes based on immediate previous experience. When you completely cut the supply of cheap entertainment, your brain, starved of its usual cheap dopamine hits, starts getting desperate for anything that feels like input. By the time that 15 minutes is up, opening a spreadsheet suddenly feels like a highly desirable task. You don't need motivation, you just need contrast. The Zeigarnik Effect. The easiest way to make sure you wake up desperately wanting to finish a difficult project is to intentionally walk away from your desk right in the middle of a sentence. Don't finish the paragraph. Don't complete the presentation. Leave it when you know exactly what to do next. Most people assume you need closure to feel motivated. The opposite is true. Your brain hates unfinished business. You'll think about the project in the shower because your brain is begging you to finish what you started. Psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik discovered that the human brain holds uncompleted tasks in active working memory far longer than finished ones. When you finish a project, your brain closes the file, forcing you to muster up the motivation to start the next one. When you leave a task unfinished, it stays actively running in the background. Your brain will obsess over that loose end, creating an undeniable urge that drags you back to the desk just to relieve the tension. The slot machine effect. Promising yourself a guaranteed reward after a hard day's work will make your brain resent the effort, but flipping a coin for that same reward will make you obsessed with it. To execute this, sit down to a grueling work session with the knowledge that at the very end, you'll flip a coin to decide your fate. Heads, you get your favorite treat. Tails, you get absolutely nothing. If you promise yourself the exact same reward every time you finish, the dopamine spike flattens out entirely because your brain already knows what's coming. To make the brain actually crave the effort while you're doing it, simply introduce gambling psychology. The anticipation of a variable reward triggers a high release of dopamine. This unpredictability is exactly why people pull a slot machine lever for hours. By making the payoff uncertain, your brain stays hooked on the suspense of the pursuit, turning a boring project into a high-stakes game. The hunt state. You can physically force your nervous system to crave diving into a difficult task just by staring at a speck of dust on your monitor for 60 seconds. Pick one small point anywhere in the room and stare at it without blinking for a full minute. When you're dreading a difficult project, your nervous system's sitting in a passive, lethargic state. You can't think your way out of that state, but you can look your way out. Staring intensely at one fixed point triggers a release of acetylcholine and adrenaline right at the brainstem. This chemical cocktail shifts your autonomic nervous system into a state of predatory readiness that our ancestors used for hunting. It elevates your heart rate and sharpens your focus, turning absolute dread into immediate action. By forcing your eyes to lock onto a target, your biology assumes you're about to pursue something critical for survival. The lethargy vanishes, replaced by an overwhelming urge to attack the problem sitting in front of you. The Ulysses Pact. Your brain will never naturally want to organize a tedious spreadsheet, unless failing to do so suddenly threatens something you already possess. Set up a pre-commitment strategy where you lock yourself into a consequence you can't escape. Give a trusted friend $100 and tell them to keep it if you don't finish your project by noon. Human neurology is wired to hate losing things twice as much as it likes gaining them. This is the cognitive bias known as loss aversion. If you try to motivate yourself with the vague promise of future success, your brain will happily ignore it and choose immediate comfort. But if avoiding the work triggers an immediate painful loss, the biology of survival takes over. Once the stakes are concrete, the hard task becomes the only route to safety. Your brain will actively seek out the work because it's terrified of paying the penalty. Identity-based dissonance. You can effectively corner your own brain into enjoying miserable tasks just by repeatedly lying to it about what kind of person you are. Repeat to yourself daily, out loud, "I am the kind of person who loves doing hard things." Psychologist Leon Festinger proved that the human mind can't tolerate a contradiction between its core beliefs and its physical actions. When your behavior doesn't match your identity, you experience severe psychological discomfort known as cognitive dissonance. The brain will do almost anything to resolve that tension. Once that identity claim takes root, skipping a hard workout or procrastinating on a project creates intense distress. Your brain starts to feel like a fraud. To escape that psychological pain, your neurology will alter its own desires, pushing you to embrace the difficult task just to verify the story you keep telling it and prove you aren't a liar. Identity is one of the most powerful forces you can use on your mind. But wait until you learn how to condition your brain to crave hard work, the same way Pavlov trained his dogs to drool. Temptation bundling. If you artificially restrict your favorite daily indulgence so it only happens during the absolute worst part of your job, your brain will learn to light up at the thought of something as terrible as data entry. Pick something you really enjoy, like a specific podcast, playlist, or drink. Make it completely off limits except while you're doing the hardest part of your work. If you try to power through a miserable task using brute force, your brain logs it as a purely negative experience. But when you exclusively lock a high dopamine item to a highly demanding task, the brain wires the two experiences together. The positive neurochemistry of the indulgence starts to bleed over. Your brain eventually forgets that it hates the hard work because it's entirely focused on the dopamine hit it knows it can only get while sitting in that office chair. Effort justification. The secret to finishing a miserable workout isn't discipline. It's putting on your shoes and standing in the driveway. Make the first step easy but deliberately annoying. Put on your workout clothes, lace up your shoes, and step outside. Your brain absolutely despises wasting energy. If you pour time or physical effort into an activity, your mind will assign higher value to that activity to justify the expenditure. In psychology, this is called effort justification. Once you pay that initial toll, the brain realizes it's already spent valuable calories. Walking away now means the suffering was completely wasted, especially if the beginning was costly. To resolve that error, your brain actively pushes you to desire finishing the rest of the project purely to validate the annoyance of starting it. The Hawthorne Effect. Thanks to your evolutionary wiring as a pack animal, simply having another person sitting in the room with you will shame your brain into wanting to look productive. You can artificially trigger performance pressure by placing yourself in the same room as another human being who is actively working. Humans are highly social primates obsessed with status and perception. When you're alone in a room, the pressure to perform drops to zero. You can avoid hard tasks because there's no social penalty for failure. The Hawthorne Effect suggests that human behavior changes dramatically the second it's being observed. Just the physical presence of another person activates your evolutionary need to project competence. The dread of the task vanishes, replaced by a deep biological urge to do the work so you don't look like the weakest member of the tribe. Task bracketing. Instead of relying on willpower, you can convince your brain to crave a miserable project the same way Pavlov trained dogs to salivate. Create one specific ritual you only ever do right before difficult work. Clear the desk, put on a specific instrumental track, and maybe even light a scented candle. Do the same thing every single time you start hard work and never at any other time. Willpower is a finite resource managed by the prefrontal cortex, which drains every time you make a decision. To make hard work effortless, you have to bypass the prefrontal cortex and hand the job over to the basal ganglia, the region of the brain that controls automatic habits. Just like Pavlov trained his dogs to drool at the sound of a bell, your brain wires that exact sequence of sensory inputs to a state of deep focus through classical conditioning. After a few weeks, the smell of that specific candle acts as a neurological switch. The sensory trigger automatically drops your brain into the work state, making it completely effortless. The 4% rule. If you're currently avoiding the project in front of you, there's a very high probability that the work is simply 4% too easy. Your brain feels most engaged when a task sits at the right level of difficulty. If a project is too hard, the brain registers it as a threat, which causes anxiety. If a task is too easy, the brain registers it as a waste of potential, completely shutting down dopamine production and causing agonizing boredom. To make your brain desperately want to engage, find that sweet spot where the challenge feels just out of your reach. By making the task roughly 4% harder than what you can comfortably handle, you hit the precise neurological zone where effort becomes addictive. The Huberman Hack. The ultimate biological cheat code requires completely ignoring the prize that comes with crossing the finish line and training your brain to get a chemical high from the struggle of the race itself. When you hit a wall of extreme frustration, you must consciously tell yourself that the friction is the exact mechanism making you better, forcing your internal monologue to validate the struggle while you're still inside it. Neuroscientist Andrew Huberman suggests dopamine is widely misunderstood as the chemical of celebration. It's actually the chemical of pursuit. If you constantly tell yourself that you just need to suffer through this sales report so you can be done and relax, you're actively training your neurology to hate the work. Your brain attaches all the dopamine to the finish line, which biologically codes the effort as a painful obstacle. To permanently crave difficult things, you have to manually hijack this system. By actively celebrating the effort, you rewire the brain to release dopamine in response to the challenge itself, and the hard work becomes the reward. We often treat hard work like a miserable chore, but your brain doesn't have to see it that way. Once you know how to trick your mind into craving the challenge, the dread evaporates, and the effort becomes something you actually look forward to.